Hello everyone, welcome to Asura Psych, and today I want to talk about the importance of the dominant function and why I think that a lot of people in the MBTI community are kind of misinterpreting Jung's original work and why they don't really understand how important the dominant function really is. Let's get into it. So, despite being a certified MBTI practitioner, I actually follow Carl Jung's work more so than I do Briggs' interpretation. And while I think that Briggs' interpretation of Jung's work and how she extended it is valuable, and it's certainly the kind of model that everyone knows and uses, I think that it's extremely important to understand Jung's original ideas. And if you don't understand how Jung originally created the concepts that make up the MBTI, then you're really going to struggle to understand what the MBTI really is and how personality types work. So the primary concept that makes up Carl Jung's personality typing system and the cognitive function system that he created is that there's one dominant cognitive function, a dominant function that is our primary way of engaging with the world. It is our conscious self. You could even refer to it as the Freudian ego, the conscious side of ourself that interacts with a large majority of the world and is primarily who we are. Jung spoke about this in his book Psychological Types, and he spoke about the importance of this dominant function. This absolute sovereignty always belongs empirically to one function alone, and can belong only to one function, because the equally independent intervention of another function would necessarily produce a different orientation, which, partially at least, would contradict the first. But since it is a vital condition for the conscious process of adaptation always to have clear and unambiguous aims, the presence of a second function of equal power is naturally ruled out. This other function, therefore, can have only a secondary importance, as has been found to be the case in practice. As you can see by what Carl Jung wrote, the dominant function is the primary way of engaging with the world. It is the sovereign part of the personality, and the secondary function is instead something that supports the dominant function. It's something that serves the dominant function, and in fact, he even directly says this in his book. Hence, the auxiliary function is possible and useful only insofar as it serves the dominant function, without making any claim to the autonomy of its own principle. The secondary function is something that is a tool to the dominant function, and in fact you'll hear in many socionics models they refer to the secondary function as the tool function, and I think that this is actually a really good nickname for the secondary function, because the secondary function exists as a way for the dominant function to get what it wants, for the dominant function to interact with the side of the self that is not dominant. For the introvert, they use their extroverted function to help obtain their inner perceptions or judgments. For the extrovert, they use their inner perceptions or judgments to help them engage with the outer world. The auxiliary function tends to also act as the personality's superego, or the ethical moral side of the self, in that it acts as a check and balance to the dominant function, a way for the dominant function to engage with other parts of the world. For example, if you took someone who was purely an introverted intuitive, or even an introverted sensing type, someone who was purely introverted perceiving and had no secondary auxiliary function, they would be unable to engage with the world. They would have no way of checking and balancing their own thoughts and perceptions. In that case, they would be stuck in one single mindset. The secondary function acts as an important balance to the dominant function so that it can properly engage with the world. Jung referred to the secondary function as relatively unconscious and non-antagonistic to the dominant function. But what we're going to talk about next is the inferior function, which a lot of people also tend to overplay or overthink when they talk about MBTI and Carl Jung's systems. You see, the inferior function in Carl Jung's view was just that. It was inferior. It was something that was never going to be directly healthy, but it was something that someone could become aware of. That said, it was never something that was going to be absolutely natural to the person. The inferior function, as you all probably know, is something that is in the opposite attitude but on the same axis as the dominant function. So, for example, the introverted thinking type has repressed or inferior extroverted feeling. The inferior function exists in an unconscious state, and what that means is that if we want to engage with it, we have to put active thoughts and active energy into actually interacting with it. It's not something that we're going to naturally use when interacting with new situations or problems. It exists in this unconscious side of ourself, much like the Freudian id, the large underside of the personality that is not naturally known. Carl Jung said, the unconscious functions exist in an archaic animal state, and that means that it's not something that we're going to be naturally adept at using. It's not going to be like that dominant function. It's going to be antagonistic to it and largely ignored in most of our lives. I have frequently observed how an analyst, confronted with a terrific thinking type, for instance, will do his utmost to develop the feeling function directly out of the unconscious. Such an attempt is foredoomed to failure because it involves too great a violation of the conscious standpoint. What Carl Jung means here is that the inferior function is not something that is naturally integrated into the personality in a healthy way, but it instead is something that we have to kind of be aware of. It's something that we need to notice and make sure that we're not going to abuse or let control our lives from an unconscious standpoint. Now, you'll notice in Carl Jung's works that he doesn't really talk about a tertiary function, and that's because he was primarily concerned with the dominant function, which makes up a majority of the personality, the secondary function, which is supportive but non-antagonistic to the dominant function, and the inferior function, which is directly antagonistic to the dominant function. The tertiary function is something that also exists in that semi-conscious state, like the secondary function, but it is the opposite side of the coin to that secondary function. So it is something that's not really going to be active or antagonistic in the personality, compared to the inferior function, which is directly antagonistic to that dominant function, and the secondary function, which is directly supportive to the dominant function. That's essentially the entirety of Carl Jung's cognitive function hierarchy, and the next step is going to be understanding how each of the 8 cognitive functions is going to manifest itself in different slots of this function hierarchy. For example, how is dominant extroverted feeling going to compare to inferior extroverted feeling? How is secondary extroverted feeling going to pair with dominant introverted intuition? How are all of the functions going to interact with each other in these different function slots? And that's really when you begin to see the entirety of a personality and how someone's going to present themselves, what they're thinking about, what their values are, when you understand the subtle nuances in the different function placements within the hierarchies. Alright everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on Carl Jung's function stack, as well as why I think that the dominant function is more important than people tend to give credit for. I think people tend to overvalue the secondary function, or think of the inferior function in a way that it's going to positively manifest itself in their life on a frequent basis. And I don't really think that's what Carl Jung originally envisioned when he was thinking of the cognitive functions. I would like to remind everyone that I do have personality typing services available, and you can learn more about that at AsuraPsych.com. This has been Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.